Light doesn't have a brain. It doesn't think, it doesn't pause, it doesn't weigh options or make decisions. And yet, when you really start paying attention to how it behaves, it becomes very difficult to shake the feeling that it somehow knows exactly where to go. A photon leaves a source and begins its journey through space, moving at the fastest speed anything can move. It travels across empty distances, reflects off surfaces, bends through materials, and adjusts its direction with perfect consistency. No hesitation, no correction, no randomness that you can see. Just a clean, precise path that always seems to make sense. If light hits a mirror, it reflects at exactly the angle it needs to. Not approximately, not close enough, exactly. The angle of incidence matches the angle of reflection every single time, as if the path was already determined before the photon ever arrived. And when light passes through something like water or glass, it slows down slightly and bends in a way that looks almost calculated. Just enough to stay consistent with the rules we've measured. Just enough to keep the entire path coherent from beginning to end. It doesn't overshoot. It doesn't wander. It doesn't need to correct itself. It simply follows the right trajectory from the start. But the deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. Because in many situations, there isn't just one possible path light could take. There are countless possibilities, different routes, different angles, different ways to get from one point to another. And yet, what we observe is not light randomly choosing one of those paths. What we observe is something that looks as if all possible paths were somehow involved, and only certain ones remain visible in the final result. Not because they were selected in a conscious way, but because everything else cancels out, as if the universe itself filters the possibilities, leaving behind only the paths that are consistent. This is where intuition starts to break down, because in everyday life, movement is something that happens step by step. An object starts somewhere, moves through space, and ends up somewhere else. The path is built moment by moment, but light doesn't behave that way. It doesn't look like it is building its journey as it goes. It looks like the entire path, from emission to absorption, is already part of a single structure, as if the beginning and the end are not separate events connected by motion, but 2 points that are already linked in a deeper way. And that raises a question that sounds simple, but becomes harder the longer you think about it. If light doesn't think, and it doesn't choose, and it doesn't have access to information in the way we understand it, then why does it always behave as if it knows exactly what it's doing? Why does it always follow the path that works, even in situations where there are infinitely many ways it could fail? Tonight, we're going to follow that question slowly, not to rush to an answer, but to understand why the question itself might be misleading. Because the more carefully you look at light, the more it starts to feel like something deeper is happening. Not a decision, not a calculation, but a kind of structure that exists across the entire process at once. And once you start seeing it that way, light stops looking like something that travels and starts looking like something that connects. The easiest way to understand light is also the most misleading. We imagine it like a tiny object, something that leaves a source, moves forward through space, and eventually arrives somewhere else. A straight line, a clear direction, a single path from beginning to end. That picture feels natural, but it's not what's really happening. Because when physicists started looking closer, they found something that completely breaks that intuition. Light does not follow one path. It doesn't pick a route and stick to it as it moves forward through time. Instead, it behaves as if it takes every possible path, not just the obvious ones, not just the straight line, but every route that connects the starting point and the ending point. Paths that curve, paths that loop, paths that seem absurd and inefficient. Every possible way to go from here to there. At first, this sounds impossible. How can something take all paths at once? How can a single photon explore an infinite number of possibilities without time, without awareness, without any kind of internal process? But this is exactly what the mathematics shows. Instead of choosing a single path, light is described by something deeper, a kind of contribution from every possible route. Each path adds something to the final outcome, not equally, not randomly, but in a very precise way. Some paths reinforce each other, others cancel each other out, and what you end up observing is the result of all of them combined. This is why light appears to follow the correct path, not because it chose it, but because all the other possibilities interfere in such a way that only certain paths remain visible. The path you see is not selected. It is what survives. This idea was formalized by physicist Richard Feynman. He described light not as traveling along a single trajectory, but as a sum over histories. Every possible path contributes, and the final behavior emerges from the interference between them. Paths that are wildly different from each other tend to cancel out. Their contributions interfere destructively, leaving no visible effect. But paths that are very similar reinforce each other, and those are the ones that dominate what we observe. This is why, in everyday situations, light appears to travel in straight lines or reflect at clean angles. Those are the paths where nearby possibilities all align, where the contributions add up instead of canceling out. But underneath that simplicity, there is something far more complex, because the photon is not traveling through space step by step, evaluating options as it goes. There is no moment where it decides which way to go. Instead, the entire set of possibilities exists as part of the process. The beginning and the end are connected not by a chosen path, but by a structure that includes all paths. And that changes the question completely. Because if light is not choosing a path, then asking, how does it know where to go, might be the wrong way to think about it. It's not that light knows. It's that the universe only allows certain outcomes to exist, and everything else simply cancels away. In the next chapter, we're going to slow this down even further, because once you accept that all paths are involved, a deeper question appears. If every path contributes, then what is actually moving? And what does it mean to say that light travels at all? Once you accept the idea that light doesn't follow a single path, something else starts to feel unstable, because now there's a deeper question hiding underneath everything we've said. If a photon is not traveling along one clear route, if every possible path contributes to what we observe, then what exactly is moving from one place to another? In everyday thinking, motion is simple. An object starts here, moves through space, and ends up there. You can point to it at any moment and say, it's here now, it was there before. Movement is continuous, step by step, unfolding over time. But with light, that picture starts to break, because the description we just explored doesn't involve a single continuous trajectory. It doesn't describe a photon passing through specific points in space, one after another. Instead, it describes a connection between two events: emission and absorption, the beginning and the end. And everything in between is not a single path being followed, but a set of possibilities that shape the outcome. So when we say light travels, we're using language that comes from our everyday experience. It feels like something is moving through space, covering distance, taking time. But at a deeper level, it's not that simple, because what actually shows up in experiments is not a photon at every point along the way. We don't observe it moving like a tiny object. We observe interactions. A photon is emitted, and later, it is absorbed. What happens in between is not something we can directly track as a continuous path, and that leads to a very different way of thinking. Instead of imagining light as something that exists at every moment along its journey, you can think of it as something defined by its endpoints, a relationship between where it starts and where it ends. The path is not something it follows. It's something that emerges when we try to describe the connection. This is why the idea of all possible paths becomes so important. It's not that the photon is physically moving along each one like an object duplicating itself. It's that the outcome depends on the structure formed by all those possibilities together. The motion we perceive is a kind of result, not a literal step-by-step process happening in time the way we imagine. And this brings us closer to something even stranger. Because if light is defined by its emission and its absorption, if the path is not something it takes, but something that emerges from the whole setup, then time itself starts to feel different. We usually think of time as something that flows forward, carrying everything along with it. First, the photon is emitted, then it travels, then it arrives. But in this picture, the beginning and the end are part of the same structure, not connected by a simple sequence, but by a deeper relationship. And that raises a question that feels almost impossible at first. What if, for light itself, there is no experience of time in between? Not a journey, not a passage, just a connection. In the next chapter, we're going to explore that idea carefully, because once you start questioning how light moves, you inevitably start questioning what time means for something that always travels at the same speed. And that's where things become even more counterintuitive. There is a strange consequence hidden inside everything we've discussed so far. It doesn't show up immediately. You have to follow the logic slowly, almost carefully, before it becomes clear. Light always travels at the same speed. Not approximately, not under most conditions, always. In empty space, every photon moves at the exact same speed, regardless of how fast the source is moving, regardless of who is observing it. This is one of the most solid, well-tested facts in all of physics. At first, that just sounds like a rule. But when you combine it with how space and time behave, it turns into something much deeper. Because according to relativity, the faster something moves, the more time slows down for it. Not as an illusion, not as a trick of measurement, but as a real effect. Time itself stretches and compresses depending on motion. For everyday speeds, this effect is tiny, completely unnoticeable. But as you get closer and closer to the speed of light, time slows down more and more. And at the speed of light, something extreme happens. Time doesn't just slow, it stops. Now, this is where things become difficult to picture, because we're trying to imagine an experience that may not even make sense in human terms. But if you follow the equations, for something traveling at the speed of light, there is no passage of time between when it is emitted and when it is absorbed. No duration. No in between. From our perspective, a photon might travel across a room, or across the galaxy, or even across the entire universe. It might take years, millions of years, billions of years to reach its destination. But from the photon's perspective, there is no time passing at all. Emission and absorption are not separated by a journey. They are part of the same event. This is not just a philosophical idea. It comes directly from the structure of relativity. And if you let that sink in, it changes how you think about everything we've said so far. Because earlier, we asked how light knows where to go. We noticed that it behaves as if the entire path is already consistent from beginning to end. But now, there's another way to see it. If there is no time for the photon in between, then there is no moment where it is figuring things out. No moment where it is choosing. No moment where it is traveling step by step. There is only the connection. The start and the end are not separated by an experience. They are linked directly. And suddenly, the idea that light takes all paths starts to feel less like something happening over time, and more like a structure that exists all at once. Not a process, a whole. This doesn't mean light is conscious or aware or making decisions. It doesn't mean there's intention behind it. But it does mean that the way we usually imagine motion as something unfolding moment by moment may not apply here at all. For light, there is no unfolding, only the relationship between where it begins and where it ends. And that leads to a shift in perspective. Instead of asking how light moves through space, you begin to ask how space and time themselves allow this kind of connection to exist. Because if something can exist without experiencing time, then maybe the idea of a path is not as fundamental as we thought. In the next chapter, we're going to step back slightly, because once you see that light doesn't experience time, the entire universe starts to look different, not like a sequence of events unfolding, but like a structure where certain connections are simply allowed to exist. If light does not experience time the way we do, then something else begins to fall into place. Because earlier, we described light as taking all possible paths, with only certain ones surviving through interference. That idea already feels strange on its own, but when you combine it with the absence of time for the photon, it starts to feel less like a process and more like a structure that already exists. From our perspective, we imagine a photon leaving a source, moving through space, encountering obstacles, reflecting, bending, and eventually arriving somewhere else. It feels like a journey, a sequence of steps unfolding over time. But if there is no time for the photon, then there is no sequence from its point of view. There is no, first this happens, then that happens. There is only the connection between emission and absorption, and that changes the meaning of the path completely. Because now, instead of thinking of the path as something the photon builds while traveling, you can think of it as something that must already be consistent from start to finish, not chosen along the way, not corrected as it goes, but something that works as a whole. This is why the laws governing light, like reflection and refraction, appear so precise. They don't emerge from trial and error. They don't arise because the photon tested multiple options over time and settled on the best one. They appear precise because only the paths that are internally consistent across the entire setup can exist in the first place. Everything else cancels out. This is the deeper meaning behind the idea that all paths contribute. It's not that every path is physically realized in the way we imagine objects moving. It's that every possibility is part of the mathematical structure, and only certain patterns survive that structure. The ones that align, the ones that reinforce, the ones that make sense not locally, but globally, across the entire journey. And this is where the original question begins to dissolve. How does light know where to go? It doesn't. There is no moment of knowing, no decision being made, no information being processed. Instead, what we call the path is simply the result of a system that only allows certain outcomes to exist. Outcomes that are consistent from beginning to end. Outcomes that don't require correction. Outcomes that don't need time to unfold. And once you see it this way, the behavior of light starts to feel less mysterious in one sense, and more mysterious in another. Less mysterious, because there is no hidden intelligence, no secret mechanism making decisions behind the scenes. But more mysterious, because the universe itself seems to enforce a kind of coherence that exists beyond step-by-step causality. A coherence where the start and the end are not independent, where the entire setup matters at once, and where the idea of a path is not fundamental, but emergent. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens when this idea is pushed even further. Because once you stop thinking of light as traveling along a single path, you start to realize that what we call motion might not be what we think it is at all. Up to this point, we've been slowly loosening something that feels very basic. The idea of motion. Because in everyday life, motion is simple. Something moves from one place to another. It exists here, then there, passing through space step by step. That's how everything we see behaves. But light doesn't fit into that picture. Not cleanly. Because if it takes all paths, and if it doesn't experience time, then the idea of a continuous journey starts to lose its meaning. We say a photon travels. But what does that actually mean? We never observe the photon in between its emission and its absorption. We don't see it moving like a tiny object passing through space. What we observe are interactions. A photon is emitted at one location, and later it is detected somewhere else. The motion is something we infer, a story we tell to connect those two events. And it's a useful story. It works. It allows us to calculate things, to predict outcomes, to build technology that depends on light behaving in precise ways. But at a deeper level, that story may not be what's actually happening. Because when you describe light using the most accurate framework we have, it's not a little particle flying through space. It's a disturbance in a field, a ripple that exists across space, described not by a single position, but by a distribution of possibilities. And that ripple doesn't move in the way objects move. It evolves, it spreads, it interferes with itself. And only when it interacts, when it is absorbed or detected, does it appear as something localized, something that happened at a specific point. So the path is not something that exists continuously. It's something that appears when the process ends. And that shifts the entire perspective. Because now, instead of imagining motion as a thing happening in time, you can think of it as a relationship between events, a structure that connects where something begins and where it ends. The idea that something moves through space becomes less fundamental than the idea that certain connections are allowed to occur. And this is where it starts to feel almost counterintuitive, because it suggests that what we experience as a continuous world, filled with objects moving around, might be built on something that is not continuous in the way we imagine. Instead, it might be built on interactions, discrete events, connections, and the patterns that emerge when those connections follow consistent rules. Light is just the clearest example of this, because it forces you to confront the limits of your intuition. It doesn't behave like a tiny object. It doesn't follow a single path. It doesn't experience time. And it doesn't move in the way we're used to thinking about movement. And yet, everything it does is perfectly consistent, perfectly predictable, perfectly aligned with the laws we've discovered, which leads to a deeper realization. The problem is not that light behaves strangely. The problem is that our intuition was built on a world that is only an approximation, a world where things are slow enough, large enough, and simple enough that we can pretend motion is continuous and paths are real. But underneath that approximation, there is something else, something more subtle, something where motion is not a journey, but a pattern. In the next chapter, we're going to bring this back to something very concrete, because once you start seeing motion this way, you begin to understand why light always seems to take the right path, not because it found it, but because only certain patterns can exist at all. At this point, the question has almost completely changed. We started with something simple. How does light know where to go? But now, it's no longer about knowing. It's about what is even possible. Because if light does not choose a path, if it does not move step by step, if it does not experience time the way we do, then the path we observe cannot be the result of a decision. It has to be something else, something deeper. And the simplest way to say it is this: light doesn't find the correct path. Only correct paths can exist. That sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Because instead of imagining a photon navigating through possibilities, you begin to see the entire system as something that only allows certain outcomes to appear, not because they were selected, but because everything else cancels out. This is where the idea of interference becomes central. When we say light takes all possible paths, what we really mean is that every possibility contributes to the final result. But those contributions don't all add up in the same way. Some reinforce each other, others cancel completely. And what remains is what we observe as reality. The path of light is not something that was chosen. It is what survives. And this survival is not random. It follows very strict rules. Rules that come from the structure of space, time, and the fields that fill them. This is why light reflects at precise angles, why it bends in predictable ways, why it forms patterns like interference fringes when passed through slits. Because all of those outcomes are the result of a deeper filtering process. A process where only certain patterns remain stable, and everything else disappears before it can ever be observed. This is difficult to picture, because it doesn't match how we experience the world. We are used to thinking in terms of cause and effect, step by step. Something happens, then something else happens, and the outcome is built over time. But here, the outcome is not built. It is revealed. What we see is not the result of a sequence of choices. It is the result of a structure that already constrains what can happen. And once you see it this way, the behavior of light stops looking like a mystery of motion and starts looking like a property of reality itself, a kind of consistency that exists across the entire process, not locally, not moment by moment, but globally, across the whole. This is why the beginning and the end matter at the same time. Why the setup of an experiment determines the outcome before anything moves in the way we imagine, because the system as a whole defines what is allowed, and light simply follows those rules, not by choosing them, but by being part of them. In the next chapter, we're going to step back one more time, because once you understand that only certain paths can exist, you begin to see that this is not just about light. It's about how reality itself organizes what is possible. At this point, something subtle has happened. What started as a question about light has quietly turned into something much broader, because everything we've uncovered doesn't only apply to photons. Light just made it visible. It forced the issue. It exposed a pattern that was already there, because the idea that only certain outcomes can exist, that everything else cancels out, that what we observe is not chosen, but what remains consistent, that is not unique to light. That is how quantum systems behave in general. Light is simply one of the clearest examples, a system where the rules are so clean, so precise, that you can't ignore what's really happening underneath. But once you see it there, you start to recognize it everywhere. Electrons don't orbit atoms like tiny planets. They exist in patterns of probability, shaped by what is allowed and what cancels out. Particles don't follow single trajectories through experiments. They produce outcomes that only make sense when you consider all possibilities together. Even stability itself, the fact that matter doesn't collapse or explode randomly, comes from the same kind of structure. Not from things deciding what to do, but from what is possible being constrained, and everything else simply not appearing. This is the deeper shift. The universe is not built from objects making choices. It is built from patterns that are allowed to exist, patterns that reinforce themselves, patterns that remain stable under the rules that define them. And when those patterns break, new ones appear that still follow the same rules. Nothing escapes the structure. Nothing steps outside of it. And that brings us back, one last time, to the original question. How does light know where to go? It doesn't. There is no knowing, no awareness, no process unfolding in time the way we imagine. Instead, light behaves the way it does because the universe only permits certain connections between events, connections that are consistent, connections that don't contradict the underlying rules, connections that survive when all possibilities are taken into account, and everything else never becomes real. So what we see is not light navigating through space. It's reality revealing one of the few patterns that can exist. And that is why it feels so precise, so exact, so strangely correct every time. Not because something guided it there, but because there was never another outcome that could survive. In the next chapter, we're going to slow everything down one last time, not to add more complexity, but to bring everything into a single, quiet picture you can hold on to. Now everything can slow down. No new ideas, no new layers, just the full picture held together. You started with a simple question. How does light know where to go? And at first, it felt like it must be doing something, choosing, calculating, reacting as it moves through space. But step by step, that idea fell apart. Light doesn't follow a single path. It doesn't move step by step the way objects do. It doesn't experience time in the way we imagine. And it doesn't choose anything at all. Instead, every possible path contributes. Some cancel, some reinforce, and what remains is what we observe. Not because it was selected, but because it is the only pattern that can exist without contradiction. And when you bring all of that together, the question changes. Not how does light know, but what does it mean for something to be allowed to happen at all? Because what you are really seeing is not motion, it's consistency, a structure that spans the entire process from beginning to end, a structure where only certain connections survive, and everything else disappears before it can ever be seen. This is why light feels so precise, so reliable, so perfectly aligned with the laws we measure, because it is not adjusting itself as it goes. It is revealing a pattern that was always internally consistent. And once you see it this way, you stop thinking of light as something traveling through space and start thinking of it as something that connects events, a relationship between where it begins and where it ends, a relationship shaped by every possible way it could have happened, filtered down to the few that actually can. And that is the quiet picture. Not light moving, but reality organizing itself. Not paths being chosen, but possibilities being reduced. Not a journey unfolding, but a structure that already works. And in the end, the question answers itself. Light doesn't know where to go. It simply follows the only paths that are allowed to exist. If you stay with this idea just a little longer, something even simpler begins to appear. Not a new concept, but a clearer way to see everything at once. Because up to now, we've been slowly removing assumptions. First, the idea that light follows a single path. Then the idea that it moves step by step. Then even the idea that it experiences time the way we do. And with each step, the picture didn't become more chaotic. It became more consistent. What remains is not confusion. It's structure. A kind of quiet order that doesn't depend on motion in the way we're used to thinking about it. Instead of imagining a photon traveling through space, you can begin to imagine the entire process, from emission to absorption, as something that exists as a whole, not built over time, not assembled piece by piece, but already internally consistent from start to finish. And that is why the path always works, because it isn't created along the way. It doesn't need correction. It doesn't need adjustment. It doesn't need to find anything. The outcome we observe is simply the result of a system where only certain connections between events are possible in the first place. Everything else never stabilizes enough to appear. This is why the idea of all paths contributing is so important. Not because light is physically exploring each possibility, like an object splitting into copies of itself, but because the structure that connects the beginning and the end includes all of those possibilities at once. And only the patterns that remain consistent across that entire structure survive as something we can observe. So what looks like a path is really a kind of alignment, an alignment between the source, the environment, and the destination. And that alignment doesn't happen in time. It is what defines the outcome. This is also why changing the setup changes the result instantly. If you alter a mirror, adjust a material, or modify the environment in any way, the pattern that is allowed to exist changes with it. Not because the photon reacts mid-journey, but because the entire structure that determines the outcome is different from the start. There is no moment where light updates its behavior. There is only a different pattern that can exist. And once you begin to see it this way, the idea of motion becomes less central. What matters is not how something travels, but what connections are possible between events. What structures remain consistent. What patterns survive when all possibilities are taken into account. And that is where the deeper calm comes in. Because instead of a universe where things are constantly making choices, adjusting, reacting, and correcting themselves, you begin to see a universe where everything unfolds according to what is internally allowed. Nothing extra, nothing arbitrary, just consistency. Light doesn't hesitate because hesitation doesn't exist at that level. It doesn't need to figure things out because the outcome is not discovered over time. It is the only stable result of the entire setup. And that's why it always feels so precise. Not because something is guiding it, but because nothing inconsistent can survive. And if you let that settle for a moment, the original question fades almost completely. How does light know where to go? It doesn't. There is no knowing. There is only a structure that allows certain connections to exist and removes everything else. And in the next part, we'll close this journey quietly by bringing that idea back to something simple you can carry with you long after the explanation is gone. At the very end of this, there is one last shift to make, not a new idea, just a different way of seeing what was already there the whole time. Because after everything we've followed, it's easy to think this is a story about light, about photons, paths, interference, and strange behavior at small scales. But it isn't only about that. It's about what you're actually looking at when you see anything at all. Because every time light reaches your eyes, every time something becomes visible, this entire process is happening. not step by step, not as a tiny particle traveling cleanly through space, but as a structure that connects where the light began and where it ends. What you experience as a continuous world, filled with objects and surfaces and motion, is built on something that doesn't behave in a continuous way underneath. It feels smooth, direct, immediate. But what's really happening is something far more subtle. Every point you see is the result of countless possibilities collapsing into a single consistent outcome. Every image is a pattern that survived, not because it was chosen, but because it is the only thing that could remain. And that means something very quiet, but very real. You are never seeing light travel. You are seeing the result of connections, connections between events that are allowed to exist, connections that remain when everything else cancels away. And once you notice that, the world starts to feel slightly different, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that changes what you do or how you move, but in a subtle way, a quieter way, because what looks like motion is not really motion in the way you thought. What looks like objects interacting is not just objects interacting. It is patterns holding together. It is structure maintaining itself. It is consistency appearing as reality. And this is why everything feels stable, why nothing flickers in and out of existence randomly, why light always behaves the same way. Because underneath everything, there is a rule, not written anywhere, not enforced by something separate, but built into the structure itself. Only certain outcomes can exist, and everything you see is one of them. So the next time you look at something simple, a surface, a reflection, a beam of light, you're not just looking at something being illuminated. You're looking at the end of a process that never unfolded the way you imagined, a process that didn't move step by step, but existed as a whole. And that is the final shift. Light doesn't know where to go. It never needed to, because what you see is not the result of a journey. It is the result of what was always allowed to exist. There is one detail that quietly changes everything once you really see it. The behavior of light is not determined along the way. It is determined by the entire setup at once, not just where it starts, but where it ends, and everything in between. The source, the environment, the materials, the possible paths, the point of detection, the whole system. When you change an experiment, even slightly, the result changes immediately with it. Not because the photon reacts mid-journey, but because the structure that defines what is possible is different from the start. You can see this most clearly in situations where multiple paths are available, like interference experiments. Add another opening or remove one, and the pattern shifts completely. Not gradually, not through correction, but instantly in terms of what outcomes appear. It starts to look as if the light somehow knew about the full setup in advance, as if it adjusted based on conditions it had not yet reached. But there is no moment where that adjustment happens. No feedback loop, no decision point, no step where information is gathered and applied. The change is not in something traveling. The change is in what outcomes are allowed to exist at all. This is the key shift. Instead of thinking of light as something moving through space and being influenced along the way, you begin to see it as something that only appears in forms that are consistent with the entire system. The path you observe is not constructed over time. It is what remains after every inconsistent possibility cancels out. And that cancellation is not a process unfolding moment by moment. It is part of the structure itself. Once you see it this way, the idea of light responding to its environment becomes less relevant. What matters is the setup, because the setup defines the space of possibilities. And from that space, only a small number of patterns survive. Those patterns are what we call the behavior of light. Not chosen, not corrected, not discovered, but simply the only outcomes that can exist without contradiction. There is another piece of this that quietly shapes everything, and it only becomes clear once you stop thinking of light as something continuously moving through space. That piece is detection, because in every experiment, no matter how complex, no matter how strange the setup becomes, What you ultimately observe is not a photon traveling. What you observe is an interaction, a moment, a point where something happens. A detector clicks, an atom absorbs energy, an electron changes state. That is the only place where light becomes something definite. Everything before that moment is not directly observed. It is described, modeled, calculated, but never seen as a continuous path. And that distinction matters more than it first appears, because it means that what we call the journey of light is something we infer, a way of connecting the beginning and the end into a story that makes sense to us. But at a deeper level, that story may not reflect what is actually happening. When a photon is emitted, we can describe its possible behavior using the rules of quantum physics. We assign probabilities, we calculate amplitudes, we consider every path that could connect the source to a detector. But none of those possibilities are real, in the sense of being individually observed. They are contributions, potential structures, and only at the moment of detection does something concrete appear, a single outcome, a single event that fits within the constraints of the entire setup. This is where the idea of collapse often enters the discussion, but even that word can be misleading. It suggests that something was physically spread out and then suddenly became localized. But a more careful way to think about it is this. The system allows many possibilities, but the act of interaction reveals one outcome that is consistent with all the rules at once, not because the others existed and then vanished, but because they never stabilized into something that could be observed in the first place. And this brings us back to the structure we've been building. If the only thing we ever observe is the endpoint of the process, then the path is not something that exists independently. It is a description of how different possibilities contribute to that endpoint. The photon is not traveling in the classical sense. It is part of a relationship between where it begins and where it is detected. And that relationship includes all the ways it could have happened, even though only one result appears. This is why changing the detector changes the outcome. Not because the photon arrives and then reacts, but because the detector is part of the system that defines what outcomes are possible. Move it, adjust it, alter how it interacts, and you change the entire structure that determines what can be observed. The result is different, not because something adapted mid-flight, but because the set of allowed connections has changed from the start. At this point, the idea of a photon as a tiny object moving through space becomes harder to maintain. What you have instead is a process where emission and detection are linked by a field of possibilities, and what we call a path is just the pattern that survives when everything is taken into account. The movement is not something happening step by step. It is something that appears when the interaction is complete. And once you see detection this way, another question naturally follows. If what we observe is always tied to an interaction, and if the path is not something that exists independently, then what role does the observer really play? Not in a philosophical sense, but in a physical one. Because the act of measurement is not separate from the system. It is part of the structure that determines what is allowed to exist. In the next chapter, we'll follow that idea carefully. Because once you include the observer in the system, the question is no longer just about light. It becomes a question about how reality itself turns possibilities into outcomes. There is a point where everything we've discussed starts to converge, and it has to do with observation, not in a philosophical sense, but in a physical one. Because every time we talk about light, paths, and possibilities, what we eventually come back to is this. We only ever see outcomes. A detector clicks. A surface absorbs energy. An interaction happens. That is where light becomes something definite. Before that moment, everything is described in terms of possibilities. Not guesses, but precise mathematical contributions. Every possible path, every allowed configuration, all of it plays a role in shaping what can happen. But none of those possibilities are observed individually. They don't appear as separate realities. They only matter in how they combine. And this is where observation becomes part of the system itself. The detector is not just passively recording what already exists. It defines what counts as an outcome. Change the way you measure, and you change what can be observed. not because something reacts in real time, but because the structure of possibilities is different from the start. This is why it can feel like the system knows what you're measuring, but nothing is being known. What's happening is simpler and deeper at the same time. The setup, including the detector, defines the set of outcomes that are allowed to exist. And what you observe is one of those outcomes. So observation is not something that happens at the end of the process. It is part of what shapes the process from the beginning. And once you see that, the idea of light traveling through space becomes even less central. What matters is the connection between events and the structure that allows that connection to appear as something real. At this point, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. When you change the setup, you don't just influence the result slightly. You change what reality is allowed to look like in that situation. This is not a small correction or a local adjustment. It's a full shift in the structure of outcomes. Take a simple example. If light can pass through two openings, you get an interference pattern, bright and dark regions, formed by paths reinforcing and canceling each other. But if you modify the setup so that you can tell which opening the light went through, the pattern disappears. Not gradually, not partially, completely. It starts to feel as if the system is behaving differently based on what information is available. But again, nothing is reacting in time. The photon is not deciding to act like a particle or a wave. What changes is the set of possibilities that can exist without contradiction. When both paths are allowed and indistinguishable, they contribute together and interference appears. When the paths are made distinguishable, that structure no longer holds. The contributions don't combine in the same way, and the pattern changes. Not because something switched behavior, but because the conditions for certain patterns to exist are no longer there. This is where the idea of light knowing what to do completely dissolves. There is no knowledge, no adaptation, no hidden mechanism making decisions. There is only a system where the setup defines what is possible, and the outcome is one of the patterns that can exist within those constraints. And once you see it clearly, it becomes almost unavoidable. What we call behavior is not something that unfolds step by step. It is the result of a structure that either allows a pattern to exist or doesn't. Once you accept that the setup defines what is possible, the next step is to see what actually remains. Because even within a fixed setup, there are still many possibilities. Different paths, different phases, different ways the system could evolve. But not all of them survive. What survives are patterns, not paths in the classical sense, but stable configurations that remain consistent when all contributions are taken into account. Some possibilities reinforce each other, others cancel out completely. And what you observe is not a single trajectory, but the result of this filtering process. This is why interference patterns look the way they do. Bright regions are not places where light went more. They are places where contributions align. Dark regions are not empty because light avoided them. They are empty because contributions cancel there. The pattern is not drawn by movement. It emerges from consistency. You can think of it as a kind of selection, but not one that happens over time. Nothing is trying options and choosing the best one. Instead, the system only allows patterns that fit together without contradiction. Everything else interferes itself away before it can ever appear as something real. This is also why small changes in the setup can produce large changes in the result. When you adjust a mirror, a slit, or a detector, you're not nudging a path. You're changing the conditions for which patterns can survive. The entire structure shifts, and with it, the outcome. At this level, the idea of light traveling becomes less useful. What matters is not the route taken, but the coherence of the whole. A pattern either holds together across the entire system, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, it never becomes something you can observe. This way of seeing is quieter, but more powerful. It replaces the image of motion with the idea of structure. It replaces step-by-step evolution with global consistency. And it explains why light always seems to take the right path. Not because it found it, but because only certain patterns can exist at all. And once you frame it like that, the original mystery shifts again. It's no longer about how light behaves. It's about why the universe only allows certain patterns to appear, and what that says about the nature of reality itself. If you stay with this just a little longer, something subtle begins to settle into place. What we've been calling a pattern is not something drawn on top of reality. It is reality at that level. The bright and dark regions, the reflections, the bending through materials, the outcomes we measure. These are not traces left behind by something traveling. They are the only stable forms that can exist when all possibilities are taken into account together. This is why trying to picture a photon moving along a definite path keeps leading to contradictions. That picture assumes there is something underneath the pattern, something more basic that the pattern is describing. But in quantum physics, that assumption breaks down. There isn't a hidden, classical trajectory that the pattern is approximating. The pattern itself is the most accurate description we have of what is actually happening. Not a summary, not an average, but the thing itself. And once you accept that, the language we use starts to shift. Instead of asking where the photon is at a given moment, you start asking what configurations are allowed by the system. Instead of imagining motion as something continuous, you begin to see it as something that only appears when interactions occur. The smooth story of a journey through space is replaced by a structure that connects emission and detection in a way that is globally consistent. This also explains why the mathematics works so precisely. The equations don't track a particle step by step. They describe how all possible contributions combine and which overall structures remain stable. When those structures align, you get predictable, repeatable results. When they don't, you get cancellation. And what we call behavior is just the visible part of that deeper consistency. So the pattern is not something that emerges after the fact. It is not something added on top of a more fundamental process. It is what remains when the system is described at the level where all possibilities are included. And that is why it feels so exact, because there is no extra layer underneath that needs to be corrected or adjusted. At this point, the idea of light knowing where to go has almost completely dissolved, not because we replaced it with a better mechanism, but because the question itself no longer fits the picture. There is no path being chosen, no movement being guided. There is only a structure that allows certain outcomes to exist, and the pattern you observe is one of them. And once you see that clearly, one last question begins to form. If the pattern is the reality, and if everything we observe comes from what is allowed to exist, then what determines those rules in the first place? At some point, the focus shifts one last time, not to the behavior of light, not to the patterns that emerge, but to the rules that make those patterns possible in the first place. Because everything we've described so far depends on something deeper remaining consistent. The interference, the cancellation, the stability of outcomes. None of it works unless there is an underlying structure that never breaks. In physics, that structure is expressed through laws, not rules imposed from the outside, but relationships that hold everywhere we look. The equations that describe light, fields, and interactions are not suggestions. They are constraints. They define what can exist without contradiction, and anything that doesn't fit those constraints simply never appears. This is why the behavior of light is so reliable, not because something is controlling it, but because the space of possibilities is already restricted. The laws don't guide a photon along a path. They define the entire set of paths that could ever contribute. And from that set, only certain patterns remain stable enough to be observed. When you think about it this way, the universe starts to look less like a place where things happen and more like a structure where only certain things are allowed to happen at all. The laws are not reacting to events. They are what make events possible. They shape the space of outcomes before anything is observed. This also explains why physics can be so precise. The same laws apply everywhere, so the same patterns appear again and again under the same conditions. Change the setup, and you change the allowed patterns. Keep it the same, and the outcome repeats with remarkable accuracy. Not because the system remembers what to do, but because there is no alternative that fits the rules. And that leads to a final shift in perspective. The question is no longer how light behaves within the laws, but what it means for those laws to exist at all, not in a philosophical sense, but in a structural one. Why these constraints and not others? Why this specific set of allowed patterns? We don't have a complete answer to that, but what we do have is something solid, a framework that works across every experiment we've tested, a structure that consistently turns possibilities into outcomes, and a system where what we observe is always one of the few patterns that can exist without contradiction. And with that in place, everything we've followed from the beginning comes together. Light doesn't know where to go. It doesn't choose. It doesn't decide. It doesn't adapt. It appears in the only forms that are allowed to exist within a set of rules that never change. And that is what makes its behavior feel so precise, so consistent, and so strangely inevitable. At the very end of this, something interesting happens. The original question doesn't get answered in the way you expect. It doesn't lead to a hidden mechanism or a deeper process that explains how light finds its way. Instead, the question itself starts to dissolve, not because it was wrong, but because it was based on a picture that no longer fits what we see. We began by asking how light knows where to go. That question assumes there is a moment where light is somewhere, unsure of what comes next, and then somehow figures it out. It assumes a step-by-step process, a path being constructed over time, a kind of local decision-making. But everything we've uncovered points in a different direction. There is no moment of uncertainty, no point where a choice is made. There is only a structure that already constrains what can happen. Once you see that, the idea of knowing becomes unnecessary. Light doesn't need information about the future because it is not navigating toward it. It doesn't need to remember the past because it is not building a path from it. The beginning and the end are part of the same consistent pattern, and what we observe is one of the outcomes that fits within that pattern. This is why the behavior feels so precise. Not because something is actively ensuring it stays on track, but because anything that wouldn't stay on track never becomes visible in the first place. The apparent accuracy is not the result of correction. It is the result of exclusion. Only what works remains. And this is the point where the intuition built from everyday experience reaches its limit. In the world we're used to, things move, react, and adjust. But at the level of light and quantum systems, that picture becomes an approximation. Useful, but not fundamental. Underneath it is something quieter and more rigid. A set of constraints that define what can exist, and a process where outcomes appear as the stable solutions to those constraints. So the question fades, not replaced, but transformed. Instead of asking how light knows where to go, you begin to ask what it means for an outcome to be possible at all. And once you see that clearly, the mystery doesn't disappear. It just moves to a deeper level, where the structure of reality itself becomes the thing you're trying to understand. At the end of all of this, what remains is not a complicated explanation, but a simpler way of seeing. Not a new mechanism, not a hidden process, but a shift in perspective that makes everything we've discussed fit together without tension. The behavior of light no longer looks like something that needs to be explained step by step. It looks like something that follows directly from the structure of what is allowed to exist. You started with the idea of a path, a photon leaving a source, moving through space, and arriving somewhere else. That picture feels natural because it matches how objects behave in everyday life. But as we went deeper, that image stopped working. Light doesn't follow a single path. It doesn't move in a continuous way we can track. It doesn't experience time, and it doesn't make decisions. Each of those assumptions fell away, not because we replaced them with something more complicated, but because they were no longer needed. What replaced them is quieter, a system where all possibilities contribute, where most cancel out, and where only certain patterns remain stable enough to appear. Those patterns are what we observe, not because they were chosen, but because they are the only outcomes that fit the rules without contradiction. Everything else never becomes real in a measurable way. This is why light always seems to take the right path, not because it found it, but because there was never a viable alternative that could survive the full structure of the system. The precision is not the result of control, it is the result of constraint. The laws of physics don't guide light along a route. They define the space of possibilities, and within that space, only a small number of outcomes can exist. And when you bring all of that together, the original question resolves itself. Light doesn't know where to go because there is no moment where knowing would even make sense. There is no process of figuring anything out. There is only a structure where the beginning and the end are linked in a way that already satisfies the rules. What we call a path is just the visible trace of that consistency. So what you are left with is not a story about motion, but a picture of reality as something that organizes itself. Not through decisions, not through adjustment, but through the fact that only certain configurations can exist at all. Light is simply one of the clearest ways to see that. And once you see it there, you can't quite unsee it. If you take one more step back, something even broader comes into view. What we've been describing does not stop at light. It shows up everywhere once you know how to look for it. The idea that only certain outcomes can exist, that everything else cancels or never stabilizes, is not a special case. It is a general feature of how physical systems behave at a fundamental level. You see it in atoms, where electrons don't move freely, but settle into specific states that remain stable under the rules. You see it in materials, where only certain structures hold together, while others fall apart. You see it in waves, fields, and even large-scale systems where patterns form and persist because they fit the constraints, not because something chose them. What changes is the scale. At everyday sizes, the patterns are so stable that they look like objects moving in continuous paths. The deeper structure is still there, but it's hidden under layers of approximation. Things appear solid, predictable, and step by step, because the range of allowed outcomes is narrow enough to feel almost certain. But with light, that structure becomes visible. The filtering of possibilities, the cancellation, the dependence on the full setup, all of it shows up clearly. It's like seeing the underlying rules without the smoothing effect of scale. And once you see it there, you realize it was always present, just harder to notice. This is why the shift in perspective matters. Instead of thinking in terms of objects and their behavior, you begin to think in terms of constraints and allowed patterns. The objects you see are the stable results of those constraints. The behavior you observe is what those patterns look like when they remain consistent over time. So the story expands. It is no longer about a photon finding its way, or even about light behaving in a strange way. It is about how reality itself organizes what is possible. Light just happens to be one of the clearest windows into that process. And once you see that clearly, there is one final step left. Not to add more detail, but to bring everything back to something simple you can carry with you. A way of seeing that stays even when the explanations fade. After everything we've built, everything we've taken apart, and everything we've reframed, what remains can be said in a much simpler way. Not because the ideas are small, but because the structure underneath them is consistent enough that it doesn't need complexity to hold together. You don't have to imagine light traveling through space step by step. You don't have to picture it choosing a path, adjusting, or reacting along the way. Those images are useful at a surface level, but they are not what's actually doing the work. What matters is the full connection between where light begins and where it ends, and the fact that only certain connections can exist without contradiction. Every possible path contributes to that connection, but most of them cancel out. What you observe is not the result of a process of selection, but the result of what remains stable when everything is taken into account. The path you see is not discovered. It is what survives. And that idea can stay with you in a very simple form. Whenever something appears precise, consistent, and almost too perfect, you can look at it in a different way. Not as something being guided, but as something that had no alternative that could exist. The precision is not added. It is the absence of everything that would break it. This is the quiet shift. Instead of asking how something finds its way, you begin to ask what makes any outcome possible at all. Instead of imagining movement as the core of reality, you begin to see consistency as the deeper layer. Movement becomes the appearance of that consistency, not the cause of it. So when you think back to the original question, it no longer needs an answer, in the usual sense. Light doesn't know where to go. It doesn't need to. The only paths you ever see are the ones that were always able to exist, given the full structure of the system. And that is the simplest way to hold the entire idea, not as a mystery to solve, but as a pattern to recognize. If you stay with this perspective just a little longer, something even quieter begins to emerge. What we've been calling motion starts to feel less like something fundamental and more like something that appears on top of a deeper stillness. Not stillness as in nothing happening, but stillness as in something that does not need to change step by step in order to produce what we see. In everyday life, everything feels like it unfolds. You move through space, time passes, events follow one another in sequence. It feels natural to assume that this unfolding is the basic layer of reality. But what we've uncovered suggests something different. At the level where light behaves the way it does, the unfolding is not the primary thing. What's primary is the structure that allows certain outcomes to exist across the entire process. That structure does not need to update itself moment by moment. It does not need to check conditions as it goes. It already contains the full set of constraints that define what can happen. And from that, what we perceive as motion appears as the visible trace of a consistent connection between events. The journey is something we see, not something that is built in time the way we imagine. This is why the behavior of light feels so exact. There is no room for drift, no accumulation of small errors, no need for correction. The outcome is stable because it is not the result of a chain of adjustments. It is the result of a pattern that already fits together as a whole, and anything that wouldn't fit together simply never appears. When you look at it this way, the world becomes slightly quieter, not because anything has changed in how it works, but because the need to explain everything through movement and decisions starts to fall away. You no longer need to imagine something navigating through possibilities. You can see it as something that only ever appears in forms that are already consistent. And this doesn't remove the sense of wonder. If anything, it deepens it. Because instead of a universe that is constantly solving problems as it goes, you begin to see a universe where only certain patterns are possible at all. A universe where what you observe is not the result of a process finding its way, but the result of a structure that never allows inconsistency to begin with. So the motion you see is real, in the sense that it appears and can be measured. But underneath it, there is something that does not move in the same way, a kind of stillness that holds the entire process together, not as a separate layer, but as the condition that makes the visible layer possible. And once you notice that, it becomes hard to look at light the same way again, not as something traveling through space, but as something revealing, in the simplest possible way, that what we call a path is not fundamental. What's fundamental is what can exist and what cannot. And in that sense, the question was never about light at all. It was about the structure that makes any outcome possible. At the very end of this, there isn't one final twist or hidden mechanism waiting to be revealed. What remains is something simpler and more stable than that. The idea that what we see is not built step by step through motion, but appears as the result of what is allowed to exist in the first place. Light was just the clearest way to see it, but the principle itself goes deeper. You can still use the language of paths, movement, and travel when it's useful. It works at the level we experience every day. But underneath that language, there is a quieter truth. The path is not something that is found. It is something that is already consistent with the full structure of the system. And because of that, it doesn't need to be corrected, adjusted, or chosen. This is why everything holds together so precisely. Not because something is actively maintaining order, but because disorder never stabilizes into something real at this level. Only patterns that fit the rules appear. Everything else cancels out before it can become part of what we observe. The result is a world that feels continuous, reliable, and exact, even though the underlying picture is not built from continuous motion in the way we imagine. And once you see that clearly, the original question fully disappears. not ignored, not unanswered, but resolved by a shift in perspective. Light doesn't know where to go. There is. If this kind of thinking pulled you in, if you felt that quiet shift where familiar ideas start to fall away and something deeper takes their place, then you're exactly where you need to be. This is what we explore here. Not just facts, but the structure behind them. Not just answers, but the way questions change when you look closely enough. Subscribe to Science Sleep Theory and let your mind slow down into ideas that don't rush, don't force, but unfold in a way that stays with you.